You have a sphere of action. Your spouse has a sphere of action. Your parents and children have spheres of action. Everyone has a sphere of action. What is a sphere of action? It is the realm in which you alone have control of and responsibility for what happens. As God is the creator and sustainer of all things, there could only be spheres of action other than His if He created creatures with the capacity of self-government. If you did not have the capacity of self-government, you would not have a sphere of action, for sphere of action can only exist in the context of self-government. The ability to think for yourself, evaluate information for yourself, believe for yourself, and choose for yourself gives you a sphere of action that is your own, which is separate from everyone else's, including God's. If each one has a sphere of action, that means that each one has their own responsibility for what happens within their own sphere of action. No one else can take responsibility for those actions. God alone is responsible for what He does in His sphere of action. Each angel is alone responsible for what they do in their own sphere of action. And each human is alone responsible for what they do in their own sphere of action. No sphere of action overlaps or runs into another sphere of action. Each is individual and separate. As humans, our sphere of action involves our thoughts, beliefs, and choices or decisions. Our sphere of action exists in our mind. We alone have responsibility for what we think, what we believe, and what we choose. Others do not have responsibility for that. Even God doesn't have responsibility for that. God's sphere of action involves everything outside of someone's own sphere of action. He is responsible for everything that happens outside of the self-government of an intelligent creature. Self-control is the ability to control my sphere of action in harmony with God's will. When I am operating with self-control, I only take responsibility for my own sphere of action. I never take responsibility for another's sphere of action. I only control what I think, believe, and choose. I never attempt to control what someone else thinks, believes, and chooses. When self-control is being exercised by everyone, then everyone is free to act for themselves in their own sphere of action. What happens when I lose self-control? I take responsibility for someone else's sphere of action, and I don't take responsibility for my own sphere of action. I blame others, including God, for what I think, say, and do, and I try to control what others, including God, think, say, and do. This lack of self-control, which is a natural effect of sinful nature, is the cause of conflict. God was right and just in creating us to be free to self-govern. He was right and just in giving us a sphere of action of our own. When someone else tries to control our sphere of action, we sense the injustice of that attempt and naturally resist it. If we were in an unfallen, sinless state, we would recognize that the one who is attempting to control our sphere of action is acting unjustly. We would recognize that this is because they are in a fallen condition, so we would pity them. We would not take personally their attempt to control our sphere of action, but we would not surrender our thoughts, beliefs, or choices to them in the slightest. We would not enter into controversy with them either, but would ourselves maintain self-control in dealing with them. This means we would never try to control their sphere of action or take responsibility for it. However, in a fallen, sinful state, things are quite different. In a fallen state, when someone else tries to control my sphere of action, I sense the injustice of it. I believe their offense is about me and against me. I am offended and take it personally. I become defensive and reactive. I try to take over or limit their sphere of action for the sake of preserving my own. Whatever I need to do to them to preserve myself, I am willing to do. I have no self-control, so I take responsibility for their sphere of action, and I don't take responsibility for my sphere of action. I blame them for what I think, say, and do, while I try to control what they think, say, and do. When there are two people taking responsibility for the other and trying to control the other's sphere of action, when you have two people trying to dominate each other, then you have conflict. Why do we do this? It is because in sinful nature, I unconsciously believe I am a god. When I am a creature, but I believe that I am a god, a lot of bad things happen. I am selfish and do all things for my sake. I try to get out of my sphere of action into God's sphere of action, trying to control time, space, circumstances, resources, information, finances, possessions, etc., resulting in stress. I think others belong to me. Since I believe I own others, I believe they are accountable to me for how they manage their sphere of action. In sinful nature, this always results in conflict. Does God have control of what happens in another's sphere of action? No, he doesn't. Is God responsible for what happens in another's sphere of action? No, he isn't. But does God hold others accountable to him for what they do in their sphere of action? Yes, he does. Why? It is because he is their creator. As every component of a system takes and gives, and as every system functions in a circuit, the function of the entire system is dependent upon the function of every individual component. For the sake of his entire system of creation, God must intervene when necessary for the good of the entire system. But God cannot intervene in the individual's sphere of action. He cannot control what they think, believe, or choose. That is their own sphere of action, not his. He can only intervene in what they attempt to accomplish. Because everyone lives and functions by God's power, he has the right to limit the power they have access to. God will never intervene in your mind, what you think, but he may intervene in your body, what you do. When he does intervene, he always does so with the best interest of his creation in mind. Why would God create creatures with their own sphere of action if things can get so messy? Individual sphere of action was absolutely necessary for God to have creatures that can love. Restoration to righteousness restores self-control. There is no more conflict because no one is getting into anyone else's sphere of action. All take responsibility for their own sphere of action. All are free, holy, happy, and harmonious.